Hi, Misha here, and this is going to be part 2 in a 2-part video. In part 1, we talked about the Mercury program, Atlas, and Redstone. But really what inspired me to do that video was wanting to talk about Gemini, and the Titan III launch system. What an important and very breakneck pace this program was, with a dozen flights, sending 16 people into orbit. And really, this is where America started to show a lead in the space program. Not right away, but eventually. But it's often overlooked, even forgotten. Mercury gets a lot of credit for being the first, and Apollo rightfully gets a lot of credit for achieving the major goals of not only going to the moon, but also Skylab and Apollo-Soyuz. But it would not have happened without Gemini. And in some ways, this was NASA at its finest, but also at its most routine, day-to-day, work-a-day, as opposed to on TV. So, let's talk about it. The program was actually the most short-lived of all of them, and was the last of the 3, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, to be approved, even though it was the middle ground. It's like they almost forgot about that middle step of we actually need to do things. So, before we dive in, if you would, please like, share, and subscribe. And as I pointed out in video 1, if you'd like to help out on Patreon, for now, we'll just use the Mishaco channel, Patreon, the main one. People have asked. I just don't think I'm big enough or important enough to have 2 Patreons. Maybe I'll make a personal channel sub-tier over there, and we can kind of do our own thing too. We'll see. Early days. But let's dive in. Last time we agreed shooting up wasn't the right word, so let's say thrusting up. Well, I guess it sounds better. Honestly, is it any wonder that the Gemini program is kind of overlooked or even forgotten today, when NASA itself almost forgot this important step? Okay, not really, but obviously Mercury had its genesis in 1958, around the time of the Explorer satellite going up. That was a foregone conclusion. And Apollo, well, the earliest concepts for a 3-seat capsule were in 1960, and of course in 61 with Kennedy's declarations, 62, and of course after his assassination, Apollo was assured. So they knew the beginning and they knew the end. It was that middle step. And there were a few different proposals in the spring of 1961, right as the first Mercuries were going into orbit, or about to, Shepard. And one was called Mercury 2, or Mercury Mark II. And it was just that, a Mercury doubled, a 2-seat craft meant to go into orbit and do various things. Now, there were other proposals, but this would eventually be greenlit and then renamed to Gemini, in the summer of 1961. So around the same time that Gus Grisham's flight would take place. And in December, it would officially be greenlit. And in January of 1962, NASA would make it known to the public. And also, the new 9, the next group of astronauts, was being picked and trained, followed by a group of 14 of the 3rd class, and so on and so forth. There were still a handful of original 7s in operations, either flight or just supporting roles. But mostly what we're going to see with Gemini are new people, although they would become very familiar. So here we have the Redstone and the Mercury laid out with Gemini here. This Model 2 is made of wood, painted up, and 1/72 scale die cast. And you notice it is longer. It's about 120 to 125 feet total, but it's wider. And this is based on a Titan series. Now, the Titan 1 was the first successful ICBM. The Titan 2, at least a variant of it, the LG, was the first to be man-rated. And the Titan 3, specifically the Titan 3C, would be kind of the workhorse for the Air Force and other programs to get satellites and unmanned vehicles into space. So Titan 2, Titan 3 were the main things. And these were two-stage rockets, and they used hyperbolic propellant, not liquid fuel. There's pros and cons to that. The cons, it's highly toxic, and yeah, spontaneous. That's kind of the benefits too. It's also simple and very reliable. Far fewer parts, far fewer moving parts. You put some chemicals together, add an oxidizer, and boom, you've got explosive gas, which can propel things and, rockets. The benefits, aside from that, are that you can just fuel a rocket up and leave it fueled for a much longer time. Also, it was very important for ICBM, so you weren't having to fuel and unfuel them all the time, so they could be made ready quicker and easier and kept ready longer. Whereas the old liquid style here, had some old things. They could also lift more, and we have an all-new capsule supporting 2 crew, the first multi-crew. It's worth noting that Russia would do Voskhod, and that would have one flight with 3 cosmonauts in it, but it was more of a stunt than a practical thing. This was meant to be an actual workhorse, because there were skills that they would need to go to the moon. Rendezvous, docking, spacewalking, generally speaking, working in space, navigating in space, things that Mercury just could not do. So the Titan was the vehicle to do it with. I was going to do that. See what I mean? They just kind of fall off. But at least they just fall on their things. We'll get to you in just a minute. And luckily, they never had to use the escape system because they did not have a tower. Instead, they were going to do ejection seats. It's been widely publicized now while that was a horrible idea because of the oxygen-rich atmosphere. It would have just been a firecracker. But luckily, they never had to use the ejection seats. It was a different approach, a different effort. After the tower, obviously Apollo would go back to escape towers, which was the way to go, although they never had to be used. Although there were some near misses. So this was designed for full orbital flight and could really get up there and lift a payload. In fact, the full craft could be anywhere from 7,000 to over 8,000 pounds, and even the reentry portion was nearly 4,500 pounds, so 50% more than Mercury. And these would be used multiple times. McDonnell Douglas would again get the contract. We'll talk more about that. These rockets were actually manufactured by Martin, and the first setups were delivered to NASA in 1963, and so the program was ramping up just as Mercury was ramping down. I should also point out that the new station in Houston would be soon coming online and would work with the Gemini operations, flight operations, although of course they would still launch from Florida. So let's dive deeper in. I considered putting this on the spinny thing, and while this is actually pegged in very well, it has 2 prongs, but they're kind of intentionally where you squeeze them together to go in. It's still really tall and heavy, so I didn't want to risk it. So we'll put this on, and I'm not even going to worry about putting it on its stand because it's wiggly wobbly. I should probably blue tack it on too. And I don't have a little 1/72 scale Gemini capsule to show you because I never have been able to. I've looked for literally 10 years. Ostensibly, Dragon did some, but I never could find them. And again, I'm not really sold on Dragon's quality. I would love it if Corgi would do one or something, but oh well. This will do. As I said in the first video, this is either 1 1/24 scale or 1/25 scale, depending on who you ask. And it's from Darren. It's an executive or mastercraft resin model, mostly resin at any rate. And this is kind of the capsule's entry configuration. In this style, it would re-enter and be about 11 feet long and about 7.5 feet wide. But in space, with everything going on, it was 18.5 feet long and up to 10 feet wide at its widest, because it had an equipment module behind it, the first really to do that. We'll see something similar on Apollo. And that would support reaction thrusters, control, oxygen, water, even some experiments and other things could be stored back there, because this was meant to be a workhorse craft. Now, actually, Gus Grissom was instrumental in designing the Gemini capsule. And yeah, you might note it looks very, very similar to Mercury. While the rocket was made by a new contractor, the capsule is basically an enlarged Mercury. Move my mic up, it slipped down a bit. Sorry, guys. But it had a lot more going on. Now, Wikipedia reports that the Mercury capsule has 100 square feet interior volume. This is wrong. I'm not exactly sure how much. Some sources say as low as 40, some say as much as 60. I tend to err on the 55 to 60 technical habitable volume, pressurized, but usable volume is probably closer to 40. This isn't much bigger. This one is actually 90 to 100. So not quite double, give or take, but we have two people in it, meaning technically they have less space, but overall they have more. And inside they would, for the first time, be able to wear more lightweight, more casual spacesuits, at least for later missions, because these were meant for endurance missions. The goals with Gemini were rendezvous, docking, endurance, working in space, experimenting thruster systems, communications. You get the idea. Basically living in space, continuing to improve food and beverages too. So there we have it. The hull is very similar material. We still have a heat shield. Early on, they actually considered doing this kind of interesting parawing landing system, but in the end they went to the tried and tested heat shield system. They weren't really trying new things. Like I said, we never had an escape tower. This would be the unit that weighed about 4,500 pounds, but fully kitted up with the equipment module, you're 7, 8, even more 1,000 pounds. So yeah, we're getting a lot more done here. And since it was designed by a pilot, this was considered the most pilot-friendly of the 3 space capsules. It still had a control stick. It could still be adjusted for pitch, yaw, roll. It also had transverse or transit abilities where you could move it up, down, forward, back, left, right. And that was absolutely required for rendezvous and docking, not to mention working in space. It would also have to be depressurized for, getting in and out and spacewalks and all that stuff. Even though the program was relatively brief, we had 12 flights, 10 of which were manned. Again, the first module was delivered in 1963, and the first test flight would occur in April of 1964. But Gemini 1 would be unmanned. It did have some experiments and sensors on board, but that was it. Gemini 2 would take a while. It wouldn't come out until January of 1965. And it was actually a suborbital flight. Although, fun fact about Gemini 2, it would be collected afterwards, refurbished, and actually reflown by the U.S. Air Force in November of 1966, being the only American space capsule to go into space twice. The NF-1 was the suborbital flight. Now, things were working okay, but Pogo, which would also plague Apollo, would be a problem. So they were trying to iron that out. But finally, March 23rd, 1965, Gemini 3 was the first manned flight and the first time that America sent 2 astronauts into space in the same craft. Thanks to the viewports or windshields, these were easier to get off, but my blue tack is holding them very well in, which is good. These are the ones that really were falling off bad, because we do have 2 hatches for each of the crew. The commander would be on the left, and the pilot on the right, although there would be dual controls for transition and a few other things so they could hand off, because they weren't really getting up and around in here. Internal volume is still pretty limited, but at least they can stretch a bit, which is good. Honestly, I don't know how they did it. Mercury, the longest mission, wasn't quite a day and a half. The longest mission in here, much longer, but we'll get to it. The first flight, well, Virgil, or Gus, was the commander, and made sense as he helped design it. It was a relatively short mission, just under 5 hours. They did 3 orbits. They tested out some systems. Now, this would still use batteries as power source. Now, one new thing here is we're going to solid-state electronics. Another thing, unlike Mercury, this has a computer on board. And it was considered a very small, very lightweight, very technically advanced computer at only 60 pounds. I won't even give you the memory specs. We just laugh, but back then it was, honest to God, a major achievement. Some other things that would fly on Gemini for the first time would be a radar, also an artificial horizon, and other quality of life things, and also things required for docking, rendezvous, communications, because space is hard to navigate in sometimes. But unlike Mercury, it actually had quite a bit of reaction thrust material to move around with, and it would conduct experiments as well. The mission plan had to be changed a bit because they were working on a new fuel cell, but it wasn't ready yet. So we're still at short missions. For longer missions, we need that fuel cell. It would be ready soon, but not quite. So in June, Gemini 4 would fly. It would have Ed White on board. And in addition to various experiments, this would be the first time America would have a spacewalk. Unfortunately, yet again, Russia with Voskhod beat them to it. But you can see where the gap was closing. Both were rushed, no argument about it, but the Russian spacewalk was more rushed. And the Voskhod was really just an adapted Vostok capsule. Now, yeah, this is an adapted Mercury, but at least it's purpose-built. The nice thing about Gemini, you could open the doors like this in space and let out the pressure. So both people had spacesuits, but the electronics could operate in a vacuum. Voskhod could not. So they actually had like an inflatable airlock thing that was pretty jank as hell. And there were problems with it, with inflation of the suit, rigidity, pressure. It's a thing. But nevertheless, Russians did claim that as a first. But Americans were quite close behind them. And while there were a few problems with Ed White's initial foray into space, it went okay. It went better than the Russians. So, in August, Gemini 5 would be the longest duration NASA flight yet, at 8 days, over a week. Now, technically, this would be the minimum time for a moon voyage, which is what they wanted to see if people could endure it, what it would do to the health, diet. But they were really hoping to push up to 2 weeks. And they were hoping to get the spacewalks down, and they were really hoping to do rendezvous and docking. But there were some problems, and that would, in some ways, be the most difficult part, even though it actually wasn't the Gemini capsule's fault. It was the unmanned Aegis targeting vehicles. Again, I wish I had a full stack, if you want to call it that, Gemini with the, I keep wanting to say service module. It's called the equipment module, but I never could find one. So I guess I should just be happy with what I have, right? After 5, there would be a bit of a lull while things were getting ready, including the extended duration power systems, power cells. And then in December of 1965, Gemini 6 and 7 would launch very close together because they were planned to rendezvous. A little confusingly, Gemini 7 launched before 6, and 7 was an endurance mission. Now, guys, I would love to go to space. I think that would be cool, especially as a kid. But even as the most optimistic kid, the idea of spending 14 days in this thing, especially without a shower, and pooping in bags next to someone else, no thanks. The guys who did 7 were very brave. In fact, it should come as no surprise that Jim Lovell was one of them. And of course, 6 would do a rendezvous. They would pass by each other in space. And this would be a first for America. Maybe not a huge monumental first by some standards, but this would be the first time 2 craft would rendezvous in such close proximity. So we're starting to kind of pull up next to Russia. So for the winter, we're not doing much. March, we get to Gemini 8. And this was planned to dock with an Agena module, unmanned module. And they did, but because of a stuck thruster, it was a very touch-and-go mission. In fact, the crew could have been lost, except for the quick thinking of a relative rookie at the time, Neil Armstrong. And they had to do an emergency deorbit after docking. So they did accomplish a few things, but yeah, it was not a successful failure, but you know what I mean. So 8 was touch and go, but it did show the skill was still there at the pilots. 9, on the other hand, had different problems. The first, the vehicle, the unmanned vehicle that it was supposed to dock with, didn't work out. Failed the launch. And then its replacement, it was kept in orbit. When it launched, I don't think I can show it here, but this cover that was on the vehicle, it was a different vehicle, but you get the idea, failed to detach. So while they were able to rendezvous, they were not able to dock. That said, another EVA was performed, so a little bit more working in space, and some scientific experimenting was done, so it wasn't a lost cause. And that gets us to 10. And in 10, we have a docking, and we have not 1, but 2 EVAs. I'm not sure if that was a first in history, but I think it was, and more experimenting was done. And we're getting closer to figuring out docking, the pros and cons, the pitfall, and they're even able to use the unmanned vehicle, the Agena vehicle, its rocket engines, its thrust, to move the Gemini capsule. Something quite important when you're thinking about the Apollo stack that will be coming up with the LEM and service module. Just testing things out. And so now we're, into the summer of 1966, and, things are looking up. 8 was a little rough, 9 had some hiccups, 10 is doing better. I'm really glad Blue Tack exists. By the way, if you were wondering what size figure would fit in here, if it's the 1/25 scale, you're looking at about 2.8 to 2.9 inches, and if it's a 1/24 scale, 3 inches would do it. So just smaller than, say, an old school 80s G.I. Joe. So I'd share that. So, Gemini 11 was be September of 1966, and it was basically a repeat performance of 10 docking, rendezvous docking, 2 EVAs, and just generally operating in space, taking care of business, trying out systems, trying out durability. Luckily not for 2 weeks. And finally, we come to the final one, Gemini 12, November 11, 1966. It's commanded by people you might recognize. Sorry, I had a call pulling up. Jim Lovell was commanding, and at this point, he was becoming pretty much America's most experienced astronaut, at least in flight time. The way the system was set up is there would be a prime crew and a backup crew. And then the backup crew would be the prime crew 3 missions later. But due to a tragedy, the crew of 9 was shaken up and things changed. And this left Lovell back commanding 12. And his rookie was a little known person, Edward Aldrin, Buzz Aldrin. And this mission was pretty much everything. Rendezvous, docking, but mostly spacewalks. Not just walking, but working in space. There would be multiple extravehicular activities for Aldrin, including a record-setting 5.5-hour spacewalk. And really this was done to show that you could work with tools, equipment in microgravity 0G. And just working out things. They also were working on like thrust guns. And of course, at this time, everyone's still tethered to the capsule. On the moon, they won't be, but at least on the moon, they've got about 1/6 gravity to work with. And this was pretty much the best success of the series. Now, in no space mission does nothing go wrong. It's too complicated for that. But the equipment performed as well as could be. And it was refined as well as could be. And we're closing out 1966. And by this point, we're drawing ahead of the Russians. True, they've got Soyuz. But 67 is going to be a rough year for both Apollo and Soyuz. Both get a little ahead of themselves in a rush and tragedy strikes. But, story for another video. Gemini, no one was lost in the program, at least in space. And 16 people would go up 10 different missions. You know, there's a couple of repeat guys, so makes sense. And it really taught working, living, operating in space. Also how to deal with boredom in space. And also it taught NASA, now based out of Houston, how to operate 2 vehicles at once in space. Think about it. It's actually very important. And it was all done relatively on budget because they're using not a terribly new capsule. Apollo would be the real big leap forward in capsule tech, but everything inside here, the computer, the nav system, the control system to some extent, the power systems, that would all be carried over to Apollo almost verbatim. A few things that weren't, well, the ejection seats. Luckily, those were done away with. And we would see refinements to the hull system, and we would definitely have to have more space for Apollo, plus a way to have a tunnel connecting to the limb, all that good stuff. But, hey, considering that this program lasted only about 1.5 years of manned flight, 10 missions is a really breakneck speed, and while there were some close calls, a very good success rate. And here Gemini is compared to scale with Mercury. You can see that really height-wise they're about the same, diameter a little bit wider, but not by a whole lot, guys. It's amazing those guys didn't kill each other 2 weeks trapped in here. I know you don't sweat as much in space and whatnot, but still, it's too close for me. No privacy. At least in Apollo, theoretically, at least on the way out, you could go to the limb. And there was at least somewhat of a lower deck to go from. Here, there was nowhere to go, unless you wanted to do a spacewalk. Even as a kid, I thought Gemini was interesting. And even as a kid, you couldn't find models. You could find Mercury, you could find Apollo, you could definitely find the space shuttle because that was the new hotness then. But Gemini, there just wasn't much made about it. I even thought the rocket was interesting with the two nozzles, the way they're done down here, the two bells. It just looks different from other. No fins, no tower. Interestingly, the Titan III was used all the way up to 1982, not for manned flights by that point, but for, satellites, things like that. So that would continue. But the Gemini program, it would be over by 67, and the first Apollo capsules would be coming online. And Apollo would serve all the way through 75 for various different roles. It turned out to be a very flexible capsule, but it could have never happened without all the trials and errors and experimenting on Gemini. Plus, all the big names really cut their teeth in here. Certainly the men that walked on the moon, most all of them, the commanders at least, were on Gemini. Michael Collins did a mission or two. And a few of the old timers did. Gordo did one in here. But it was mostly the new 9 and then the third crew of 14. So, just felt like talking about these. I don't know why. Just in the mood. So let me know what you think. As always, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, just go over and you can go to Patreon for Mishaco, and it all goes to the same place. See how that goes. And I will cover Apollo, but that's a much bigger program and project that I need to do today. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.